Atheist U presents Cosmological Arguments, Part 1, Version 1. Thanks for watching. As an abstract, if you ever heard the phrase, every painting has a painter, or every building has a builder, you've been subjected to some form of a cosmological argument. Most frequently used to argue the universe itself had a creator or some sort of cause, namely a particular religion's preferred version of a god. They'll say, things don't create themselves, or where did the universe come from? There certainly is a lot of uncertainty surrounding these concepts, and the world is replete with people chomping at the bit, ready to swoop in and say their claimed version of a god did it. Supernatural religious apologist Frank Turek likes to sum up his take on the issue thusly: I believe in the Big Bang, I just know who banged it. This quote is indicative of part of the reason why supernatural religious apologists love cosmological arguments so much, because scientific mystery gives anyone a chance to wax poetic about a domain of human intellect which has historically been a one-way street. Every time we've corrected a previous supernatural idea, it's been replaced with an answer garnered via the scientific method. Supernatural religious apologists hate this fact. Cosmological arguments let them weaponize gaps in understanding to gain leverage and a ploy to convince you their claimed version of a god exists. It can be frustrating discussing these ideas. Part of the problem with answering cosmological arguments is they don't have one flaw you can point to. It has dozens and dozens of flaws. Many of the errors are multifaceted and then overlap on other problems. First, it'll make a philosophical error, then another, then a scientific error which overlaps part of the first two philosophical errors, then they'll compound a linguistic error on top of all the previous errors. When addressing these problems, where do you start? What error do you explain first? This video is my attempt to itemize most of the problems with cosmological arguments into a one-stop source to refer people, and offer suggestions to skeptics trying to help apologists who make these mistakes. Before I dig into the argument, I'm going to briefly cover some administrative stuff. I color code my videos. Blue, white is curriculum, black is commentary or an aside, orange is when I'm trying to focus attention for emphasis. Purple annotates the problems for these arguments. When you see purple, think problem. If you're watching as an apologist, this is where I want you to pay attention. This is what's wrong with these ideas, and if you plan on responding to my videos, I've numbered them, so feel free to refer to them as reference if offering rebuttals. Red is something I probably shouldn't be talking about because it's above my pay grade, but I have to because apologists talk about it, and I need to talk about what they talk about. I tread with much trepidation here because the areas I've coded red are very tricky and only partially understood by the most specialized of highly trained scholars. Invariably, I will make mistakes and overgeneralizations which apply to some aspects but not others. Forgive me. Green is an anticipated objection by apologists, numbered for reference. I'll also be offering possible responses for people looking to engage in this discussion from a skeptical perspective. If you're watching this video to learn how to refute arguments or for tips during a conversation, I want you to focus on gold, silver, and bronze colors. This is the system I use to convey how impactful I think a particular response is. Borrowed from the Olympics because I'm super original. Gold responses are the best, bronze are serviceable but lacking gravitas for whatever reason, and obviously silver is somewhere in between. I'll be using a lot of circles when I need set theory. Circle colors are to differentiate sets, not significant for any other reason. I use a lot of non-standard acronyms, and it can be confusing but serves several very important purposes. This is the legend. Supernatural religious apologist is SNRA. Supernatural is SN. Claimed version of a god is CVOAG. Materially or materially effective is MOME. I'll say the full phrase in audio, but on screen the acronym saves space, and in written dialogues they save valuable keystrokes. Plus the acronyms themselves are effective at expressing mistakes apologists are making. Preemptive apology. I have to admit, this video is long, but it has to be. Cosmological arguments can be persuasive because they are deceptively simple, but its errors are numerous, layered, and some are complex to expose. Supernatural religious apologists have lots of advantages. For example, ideas are very simple to pollute, but time-consuming and difficult to cleanse. My video is also long because I'm making one for apologists and skeptics alike. If you're an apologist, this link might have been posted as a response to an argument you've made to save millions of keystrokes explaining all this repeatedly. I've also got advice for skeptics on how to deal with these arguments. Making a video for a wide audience means I have to cover a lot of ground. Sorry. If apologists made fewer or simpler mistakes, videos explaining them would be shorter. The length of this video will certainly reduce the number of people willing to watch it. I'm fine with this. I'd rather be accurate and thorough than terse and popular. When I offer responses for skeptics to say to an apologist, there is more than one method to formulate a retort. Method 1. Face value. You can accept the argument wholesale and give an honest response. Method 2. You question the question. If they've made a mistake in formulating their statement, instead of responding on face value, you can ask a probing question to help them figure out the error for themselves. Method 3 is to get meta. You see the error they've made, but you ask them about some kind of critical thinking move unrelated to the argument, but still helpful for them to figure out their mistake. I'm not the biggest fan of method 1. Every statement relies on certain definitions, assumptions, and occasionally fallacies. If you answer on face value, you've granted these. Methods 2 and 3 challenge them. I'm not a big fan of granting errors. I prefer assisting people in fixing them. Ever hear someone say, "This is the bread and butter of that"? It's an idiom meaning a staple. Something which is vital, i.e. bread and butter is a staple to having dinner. Lots of restaurants serve it complimentary because it's just an expected part of the meal. Supernatural religious apologists have staples in their repertoire as well. For example, the bread and butter of apologetics is equivocation, which I'll explain later. They have multiple obligatory failures you can set your watch to. So many, in fact, there's enough to stretch the analogy of bread and butter to other items. Like begging the question happens enough to warrant being called the meat and potatoes of supernatural religious apologetics. Now this gets a little silly, I'll admit, but apologists commit so many failures, they give lots of opportunity to talk about their silliness in silly ways. The wine and cheese of apologetics is affirming the consequent, milk and cookies is strawmanning, coffee and donuts, argument from ignorance, beer and pretzels, argument by assertion, bacon and eggs, persuasive definitions, burger and fries, reification fallacy, sushi and sake, special pleading, tacos and burritos is incommensurate evidence. But why stop at food? Tableware can be analogous too. Fork and knives is trying to put words in your mouth, and plates and bowls is double negatives. There's plenty more to go around, but I'm limited by available emojis. I'll explain each as they come up if needed. Enough admin. What are cosmological arguments? Casually, they're an argument for existence, usually a claimed version of a god. Dictionaries are not official, they only reflect common usages. However, they offer a good starting point. Cosmology, according to this dictionary, is, usage 1, a branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of the universe. Usage 2, a branch of astronomy dealing with the origin, structure, and space-time relationships of the universe. Cosmological is relating to the origin and development of the universe. You'll often hear these ideas referred to as prime mover, infinite regress, origins, or first cause type arguments. Formally, cosmological arguments are a set of axioms and a series of premises leading to a conclusion that things have beginnings and or creations. Another way to look at what cosmological arguments are is as one part of a cumulative case supernatural religious apologists make for the existence of their claimed version of a god. By analogy, think of a table. Everyone has ideas in their head and we have different ways of supporting them, in a similar manner to how a table supports the weight of something like a vase. Some people say they believe in the existence of claimed versions of gods like Vishnu, Yahweh, and Zeus. One of the ways some of them support this idea is with the cosmological argument. It's like a leg of the table supporting an idea. But this one argument is not the only leg supporting the table. There's morality arguments, ontological, teleological, and several others. This video will be detailing the problems with the cosmological argument only. If this video was super effective and I was able to convince everyone the argument was an absolute failure in the highest regard, and supernatural religious apologists admitted what an absolute dumpster fire of an idea it is, and removed it as a device used to support their table, the other arguments would still remain supporting the idea of their claimed version of a god as an existent thing. Just because one particular argument has been eviscerated, people will not all of a sudden abandon their claimed ideas. Next, how do you know you're dealing with a cosmological argument as opposed to one of the others? What does this one sound like? For the best way to identify this type of argument as distinct from others, listen for these key words: cause, begins, exist, universe. People don't usually walk around saying premise 1 blah blah blah, premise 2 blah blah blah, therefore bleh. This argument manifests more casually. You'll hear it this way: where did everything come from? How did everything get here? Something can't come from nothing. From nothing, nothing comes. There's never been nothing. There's always been something. Things don't create themselves. What happened before the Big Bang? Why is there something rather than nothing? Who created the universe? Etc. I'm going to circle back to address each one of these later on, but it helps to understand them better if we first look at how the argument comes in a more formal way. There are different varieties of this argument. I'll call them the classic and the kalam. There are others, but these are the most prominent. An example of what this sounds like. Here's a video. And I'm really sorry for this. It's excruciating to watch. Pay attention for the keywords.
I am confused. Being philosophically consistent and being a very honest person, I'm sure you can tell me where God came from.
All right. Go ahead. All right, your question, where did God come from, assumes that you're thinking of the wrong, obviously it displays that you're thinking of the wrong God, because the God of the Bible is not affected by time, space, or matter. If he's affected by time, space, or matter, he's not God. Time, space, and matter is what we call a continuum. All of them have to come into existence at the same instant, because if there were matter but no space, where would you put it? If there were matter and space but no time, when would you put it? You cannot have time, space, or matter independently. They have to come into existence simultaneously. The Bible answers that in 10 words. In the beginning, there's time. God created the heaven, there's space, and the earth. there's matter. So you have time, space, matter created a trinity of trinities there. Just, you know, time is past, present, future. Space has length, width, height. Matter has solid, liquid, gas. You have a trinity of trinities created instantaneously, and the God who created them has to be outside of them. If he's limited by time, he's not God. The guy who created this computer is not in the computer. He's not running around in there changing the numbers on the screen, okay? The God who created this universe is outside of the universe. He's above it, beyond it, in it, through it. He's unaffected by it. So the concept that a spiritual force cannot have any effect on a material body, well then I guess you'd have to explain to me things like emotions and love and hatred and envy and jealousy and rationality. I mean, if your brain is just a random collection of chemicals that form by chance over billions of years, how on earth can you trust your own reasoning processes and the thoughts that you think? Okay, so your question, where did God come from, is assuming a limited God. And that's your problem. The God that I worship is not limited by time, space, or matter. If I could fit the infinite God in my 3-pound brain, he would not be worth worshiping, that's for certain. So that's the God that I worship. Thank you.
Huh? This is from a debate in 2004 between 3 professors, and the man in the red blazer is Kent Hovind. He calls himself Dr. Dino. I'll only be discussing his ideas. When I put someone in my video, I'm only talking about their ideas. They stand or fall on their own merits. People's personal lives have nothing to do with the veracity of their ideas. You actually heard 2 arguments in the video. Cosmological and evolutionary argument against naturalism. I'm only dealing with cosmological for now. If it sounded like he was running a script, it's because he was. Questions and statements I'm going to offer for skeptics to respond back to people like this are designed by me to knock apologists off script by helping them see mistakes they've made. A little bit of history. How did we get this argument in the form we have it today? Augustine of Hippo was credited with inventing the doctrine people who call themselves Christian refer to as original sin. Effectively, everything bad is our fault because the alleged persons of Adam and Eve were endowed by a claimed version of God with free will and they chose to disobey. This wasn't impressive enough for Anselm of Canterbury. He was famous for making noises which sound like, God is that which no greater can be conceived, and existence is greater than non-existence, ipso facto, my claimed version of a God exists. This makes up much of the ontological argument I'll deal with in another video. None of this was adequate for Thomas Aquinas. He needed more legs supporting his table, so he is credited with coming up with what's called the 5 proofs. Use of the word proof here would be colloquial and not technical. In his book, Theology Summary, he laid out an argument for motion, causation, contingency, gradation, and design. The first 4 are more or less what we think of today as the cosmological argument, with the 5th being part of the teleological argument with cosmological roots. I'll be covering teleology in other videos. A classic version of the argument sounds like this. Premise 1. Everything which exists has a cause. Premise 2. The universe exists. Therefore, the universe has a cause. And by the way, it just so happens to be our claimed version of a God. If you're a religious apologist, I can hear you crying. No one uses this argument anymore. Yes, I know. Just bear with me. This is relevant to the version you use as well. What's wrong with the classic? It should be painfully obvious. Premise 1. The word everything. What is everything? Is everything all things? If a claimed version of a God is a thing, premise 1 would apply to it. The very thing cosmological arguments are trying to establish as existent cannot exist if the first premise is accurate. It's a paradox, and problem number 1. I'll put the problem numbers in the upper right-hand corner to hopefully make it easier to follow along. What's wrong with the argument? Capital G God needs a cause. From the video we saw Professor Mustache, his name is actually Reinhold Schleider, and I'm sure he's a very nice man, but I'm totally envious of his mustache, so I call him Professor Mustache. We saw Professor Mustache asking Hovind, where did God come from? Which is similar to saying, what caused God, or who created God? These questions all address problem number 1. The issue is, Hovind didn't make the classic cosmological argument. In the full version of the debate, to be fair, Hovind never made any kind of cosmological argument up to this point. The professor made a major tactical error asking Hovind to defend an idea never espoused. There are a couple other important problems with this version I need to address before moving on. Number 2 is a hidden assumption in premise 1 of capital G God exists. Problem 3 is begging the question, starting with your answer and then trying to confirm it with your premises. This is the meat and potatoes of apologetics. Also known as circular reasoning, or assuming the conclusion, the very thing you're trying to argue for, you've started with, taken for granted, and layered on a bunch of prior assumed ideas to bolster your conclusion. This argument is begging the question because premise 1 includes capital G God. These problems have asterisks next to them because they overlap other issues I'm going to discuss later. Like I said before, this argument is no longer in style because apologists got sick of people pointing out problems 1 through 3. Their objections are almost exclusively to problem number 1, and they sound like God is eternal, God exists necessarily, God is an unmoved mover, God exists outside space-time so isn't subject to the same rules. All these objections fail for a myriad of reasons, but most notably, argument by assertion, special pleading, trying to define things into existence, etc. After you've asked them a question and they've seen the error, sometimes they'll respond with, asking who created God assumes the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason should be another standalone video, but for now I'll just state the typical meaning, which is everything needs a reason or cause for why it is so, which is just premise 1 of the classic Cosmological restated. The principle of sufficient reason objection fails for all the same reasons as the others do, but also, if anything can be explained without a creator, so can the universe. The most popular way out of this trap of problems 1 through 3 is to try to prevent the problems from being noticed in the first place. This move is what Kalam is all about. Kalam exists to pre-circumnavigate this clearly decapitating flaw. The reason the video example watched like such a slam dunk for Hovind was because he knew the Kalam workaround and Professor Mustache did not. So you should know the Kalam workaround. Kalam is not a person's name. In Arabic it means speech, word or utterance, as in the word of capital G God. Think of Kalam as a group of scholars sitting around a think tank trying to figure how to get around the problems of 1 through 3. Kalam goes like this. Premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Therefore the universe has a cause. What's wrong? As it turns out, can be a little more difficult to see than the obvious problems with the classic. Let's talk about what's going on in broad terms. I'm going to put the classic on the left and the Kalam on the right so we can compare. This is my base screen as sort of a dartboard to expose problems in the formal versions of the arguments. The first thing to notice is problem number 4. The only difference between the classic and the Kalam is these 4 words they've added to premise 1 and premise 2. Begins to and began to. Notice, all they've done is change the claim. Just added some extra words on the screen. They haven't presented anything testable, haven't brought in any observable data for us to examine, merely a little wordplay to slightly alter the claim. The problem is, it's an argument only. It's verbal sleight of hand. Arguments are great for establishing the existence of conclusions, premises. Arguments are only evidence of the existence of the kind of ideas arguments foster. They're a good place to start sometimes, but if you want to establish genuine knowledge about the world around you, arguments can only carry you so far. Eventually, you're going to have to get up out of your armchair and test your ideas in the world around you. Arguments are only sufficient to establish the existence of things which exist argumentatively. If supernatural religious apologists are intending to argue for the existence of a claimed version of a God, which is purely the result of our words and arguments, I agree with them. But a kind of God which can split the Red Sea, impregnate virgins, resurrect people from the dead, throw lightning bolts, is not merely a set of axioms and premises with a conclusion. This claimed version of a God is either material or materially effective. You can't argue something like this into existence unless you're saying it exists purely in your head as a concept. Arguments are incommensurate evidence for the type of gods apologists are supposed to be making a case for. Incommensurate evidence is the tacos and burritos of apologetics. A method 3 type question you can ask someone who's made this error might sound like this. Does your claimed version of a God exist only as the conclusion of an argument? Or, can we argue a claimed version of a God into existence? Or, are arguments invented or discovered? Are arguments merely our concepts? Does your claimed version of a God exist merely as a concept? You get the idea. Before I dig deeper, I'm going to make a quick side note. If you're having a conversation with a supernatural religious apologist who purports to believe in 2 out of the 3 Abrahamic monotheisms, they absolutely love this stuff. The reason why is because they get to say beginning, beginning, beginning over and over and over again. And the first few words of the text they claim to believe in is, in the beginning, capital G God created the heaven and the earth. And some of the smartest minds in relevant scientific fields use some of the same terminology to talk about the universe as the text does. They point at the argument, the text, the smart guys, and endlessly loop around repeating beginning, beginning, beginning millions of times like a broken record. Muslims love this line of argumentation too, but they think the book of Genesis has been abrogated. Next problem, number 5. Hypothetically, even if this argument was the complete bullseye supernatural religious apologists are hoping it is, at its very best, it could only establish some form of weak deism. In case you're unfamiliar, deism is the belief in a non-interventionalist claim version of a God. Most of the apologists who are using Kalam are trying to advocate for the existence of a theistic claim version of a God, one which answers what they call prayers and occasionally intervenes to alter the order of reality. This argument on its best day can't get us to any recognizable specific God claimed to exist by any religion. Problems number 5 through 8 all revolve around this fact. A method 1 question you can ask someone about this to knock them off script might sound like, deism at best. How do we get to your specific brand of theism? The same type of question would apply to problem number 6, which is the belief in any specific claimed version of a God yielded by this argument fails the outsider test for faith. Philosopher John Loftus gets credit for the name outsider test for faith, which he wrote a book about of the same title. It's good, you should read it. A very long-winded question pointing this issue out might sound like this. People who call themselves Christians wouldn't accept this argument as establishing the existence of Vishnu, and people who call themselves Hindus wouldn't accept it as relevant to the existence of Yahweh. Why should I or anyone else accept it as persuasive to think anyone's claimed version of a God exists? They can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. Clearly this question is not a home run because it's wordy, but the concept addressed is uber salient. The next deism-related problem is number 7. I'm calling this gap problem number 1. Claimed versions of gods are alleged to be moral agents, moral lawgivers. A deist god wouldn't be concerning themselves with the day-to-day morality of mortals. You can't get a moral agent from establishing a deist god. This problem really impressed Scottish philosopher David Hume. I personally don't think this is a very useful angle to play in these conversations, however some do. I submit it as a tool for your toolbox, should you find it compelling. A method 1 type question we could ask someone to help them realize this might sound like, how does this get us to a moral agent? Number 8 I'm calling gap problem number 2, which is again deism oriented. How would you know there was only one causal agent? How would you know the difference between one or a committee of 3? How would you know it was a claimed version of a god and not an alien and his right-hand man Dracula with a robot assistant? Cosmological arguments can't close this gap even if they hypothetically worked, which they very much do not, as I'm about to detail. Supernatural religious apologists have ready-made objections to this problem of deism at best. They'll make noises like blah 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 faith and stuff, or they'll appeal to other legs of the table, or say, yeah I know, but the Bible and stuff. All these fails for a collection of reasons again, in addition to the same failures we saw before with problems 1 through 4. Problems 5 through 8 also emerge later on. Problem number 9 is tensed time. This is a big subject worthy of its own series of videos, but I'll offer a quick touch and go. There are different ways we have for talking about this concept we call time. Think about 3 events: the Stoneheads being placed on Easter Island, you watching this video, and the eventual heat death of the universe. Not the best emoji options here, but I've settled on the checkered flag. There are different modes of language we have for speaking about those events. Tensed and tenseless. Tensed is often referred to as an A theory of time, where events are referred to in the A series. This is also occasionally called presentism. A theory language uses words like past, present, and future. On A theory, imagine you lived before the Stoneheads placement on Easter Island. We always feel like we're living in the present. It would seem like this event of the Stoneheads was in your future. As you observe the event take place, it would seem to move from the future to the present, then when it was over would seem like an event in the past. On an A theory, this event would seem like a fixed time in which it occurred, and you passed through it as an observer, which would make it seem like as of this moment the Stoneheads are in the past. You watching this video is in the present, and the heat death of the universe is in the future. On a B series of time, also known as eternalism, events don't have fixed times they occur in, rather fixed relationships to other events. For example, Stoneheads would be earlier than World War II, but neither event is past, present, future relative to you. They're both just earlier than. On the B theory, the Stoneheads are earlier than. You watching this video is simultaneous as any other event taking place right now, and the eventual heat death of the universe is not in the quote-unquote future, it's just later than. B theory language is about relationships of events to other events, rather than events having fixed times they occur in. The reason this is a problem for cosmological arguments is they require tensed language to be accurately reflective of reality, and it's just not the case. Tensed language fails to merge with relativity, particularly when it comes to the words cause and begins. Supernatural religious apologists have an objection to problem number 9. They've written entire books on the subject like Time and Eternity by William Lane Craig. I can't adequately address all of his points here, but for the most part, they can be summarized by saying A theory of time fits our intuition. This fails because, so what? Our intuition is frequently wrong, especially when it comes to the confluence of the way space-time itself behaves and our ability to observe it. Consider this. When you look into the mirror, it seems perfectly intuitive you're looking at an image of yourself in real time, but you're not. The light bouncing off you onto the mirror and reflecting back into your eyeballs has to travel a distance. Traveling distance takes time. In this case, it's a fraction of a nanosecond. It seems instantaneous, but it's not. At 1G on Earth, this never costs us any noticeable awareness. However, when you zoom out, the distance between us and the sun seems inconsequential, but again, our intuition fails us. It takes about 8 Earth minutes for the light coming from the sun to reach the surface of the Earth. So if the sun had extinguished or went supernova 7 minutes ago, we would be blissfully unaware for at least another minute. The light from stars in the night sky takes millions of years to reach us. Many of them, in fact, exploded millions of years ago. But to us, the light is only reaching us right now, so we're experiencing them as they were when they were alive. The event taking place simultaneous with our observation is not the event actually going on in the areas we're able to witness the light coming from. The experience of time is relative, tenseless. This is just the tip of the iceberg, too. Your experience of time is not just affected by your relative position, but also by your relative speed. The faster you travel, the slower time passes for you. Sounds counterintuitive, but we know it's factual because we have to account for this in our GPS satellites. As you're sitting still on the surface of the Earth, Satellites in orbit are traveling faster to stay geosynchronous, and we have to account for this in the clocks we set on them. If you don't like this, all you have to do is overturn pretty much everything we've learned about spacetime in the last 100 years. Because of this and more, the fact cosmological arguments rely on tensed language makes them dead on arrival. This doesn't mean we know everything about how spacetime works, only we know tensed language doesn't support the case for a claimed version of a God existing via this argument. Problem number 10. What if I said to you, water droplets are small? Hurricanes are composed of water droplets. Therefore, hurricanes are small. You recognize what's wrong right away. This is an expression of what's known as the fallacy of composition. Properties of subsets are not necessarily properties of the whole. Just because water droplets are small and hurricanes are composed of water droplets does not mean hurricanes are small. So if someone says to you, things inside the universe have beginnings/causes, therefore the universe has a beginning/cause, you see what mistake they've made. Us labeling events inside the universe as caused, began, doesn't mean the universe on the whole was caused or began in the same sense. Cause and effect only applies to existent things. They are contingent properties of spacetime. A method 2 question you could ask someone might sound like, are properties of what something is composed of necessarily properties of the whole? The right answer to this question, of course, is no. This is bronze because it can take some time to explain this error. People generally aren't too keen on listening attentively while you meticulously itemize all the fallacies their favorite ideas require. Problem number 10 also appears later on in other mistakes with these arguments. 11. Consider the statement, Eric grows bananas. Subject, verb, object. A specific kind of verb known as transitive. Words like grows, cause, create, begins. Eric would be the subject, grows the action, and banana the object. In this example, Eric would be the cause of bananas growing. Transitive verbs must be used as subject acts on object. In the sentence, Yahweh creates universe, the structure is the same. The verb causes is again transitive. This presents another problem. Causality requires temporality. Intemporal causation is an incoherent concept. It's trying to say, a thing which requires time caused time. Another paradox. Causes are always antecedent to their effects. The universe is alleged to be the effect of a claimed version of a God, but they can't cause anything until time exists for it to exist and to cause things. Cosmological arguments co-locate causes with their effects. There is overlap with problem number 10 here. If we express spacetime as a red line, from the first moment to now, causes have been events happening to things on the line, always antecedent to their effects. We don't know the line itself has a cause in the same way events are caused on the line. So far as we can tell, there are no causes to the left of the line. No causes. Existence came into existence on this model. Causes are existent things, so causes started existing here. If and only if spacetime is the whole of existence, then existent things didn't exist until there was existence. The Big Bang is not an event in the universe. It's the first moment we can measure of our local representation of the universe. To assume there are causes outside of our ability to measure is begging the question and stretching the models beyond their limitations. If you claim something is spaceless, where are you saying it exists? How does a spaceless thing interact with spaceful things? If a claimed version of a God is supposed to be timeless, when is it supposed to exist? How does a timeless thing interact with time-full things? Remember, Kent Hovind made similar complaints. He was trying to impose the concepts on our local representation of the universe itself, but didn't apply the same rationale to his claimed version of a God. No time for his claimed version of a God to exist, no place for it to exist. These are problems for his claimed version of a God, and he's trying to shift the burden onto anyone skeptical of its existence. He is projecting because his ideas don't work without assuming them to be correct independent of commensurate evidence, and it makes him uncomfortable. He's trying to pass the buck. If someone wants me to think something exists, somehow, some way, some when, they're going to need to give me a discernible way to detect its existence. A method 2 type question might sound like, do causes always precede their effects? Or, can causes happen simultaneously with their effects? The right answer, of course, is no. Existence is prerequisite to being a cause. Atemporal cause is incoherent. Supernatural religious apologists who make cosmological arguments are trying to assert their claimed version of a God exists as a causal agent, without a time to cause things. Another paradox. The objections to 11 typically sound like, only effects need a cause. A first cause is not an effect, so exempt from causation. Or, the universe is contingent. God is not contingent. A necessary being. This is how contingency arguments start out, which is a verbose way of arguing by assertion, special pleading, and the rest of the usual suspects among apologetic failures. Problem number 12 is an argument from ignorance, also known as the God of the Gaps, which is the coffee and donuts of supernatural religious apologetics. Even if the argument was able to establish the universe had a beginning, cause, we wouldn't be able to use the argument to figure it out. To be fair, technically cosmological arguments don't do this. But apologists almost always do by implication right after they get done giving the argument. If we don't know the answer to something, we don't get to shove whatever explanation we like into this gap. We need positive evidence for the existence of something, not evidence of our lack of understanding. The way I usually sound addressing this problem is more of a method 3 type question. If we don't know the answer to a question, does this mean your claimed version of a God is the default? Of course, the right answer again is no. Now to address what's going on with this argument syllogistically. Problem number 13. Consider two sets. Let's call them fruits and veggies. Inside the sets of veggies, we can have things like broccoli, carrots, potatoes. Inside our set of fruits, we could put things like apples and oranges. Then we can make a subset within our sets, like the subset citrus. Lemons and oranges would fit into this subset. Apples would not fit in the citrus subset, but still be perfectly at home inside the larger set of fruit. It just depends on how you want to categorize and compare things. This is why we make sets, to compare groups of multiple items on points of similarity and difference. Let's say you make a grocery list, and you have no items on your list. Is a list with no items a list? If so, how? There's no sense in writing a list if you have no items to list. Now let's say you want to make an actual list, but you only need apples. Did you make a list, or did you simply write down the word apples on a piece of paper? Is a one-item list a list? Not really. Unless you're listing more than one item, you aren't making lists. Whole point of making a list is to track multiple items. The same applies to building sets. No sense in building a set if we have no items to put into it. Just like a list. If you only have one item in your set, no sense in establishing the set. You only need the utility of a set if there are multiple items in it. Considering this principle, let's make some sets. A set of things which began to exist on the left in light blue, and a set of things which did not begin to exist on the right in green. Apples, oranges, lemons, they all began to exist, blue for sure. What goes in the green set? The way I see it, we have three options. We can put 0 items in our green set, 1 item, or greater than 1 item. Look at what happens to our cosmological syllogisms when we explore these possibilities in the green set. In the case of 0 items which did not begin to exist, premise 1 is now reduced to everything which exists has a cause, because we have 0 items which have not begun to exist. We no longer need the caveat begins to or began to, because there are no items to account for which did not begin to exist. Remember, there's no sense in establishing an empty set. There's no need to account for things in the green set if there are no items in it. 0 items in a set is the same as no set at all. In this case, premise 1 of Kalam is identical to premise 1 of the classic. We can't have this because the whole point of inventing Kalam was to avoid the pratfall of including your conclusion in the premise, thus requiring it to have a cause. Kalam was invented to circumnavigate problems 1, 2, and 3. So 0 green items fails for many reasons we've already covered. What happens to the syllogism when we put greater than 1 item in our green set? Technically, to be fair, it makes the Kalam a valid syllogism. Not colloquially valid, technically valid. As a side note, in regards to Kalam, technical validity doesn't mean it's established the existence of a cause for the universe, just means the conclusion logically follows from the premises. True premises equals true conclusion. But it's only true in the sense it complies with axioms. Kalam is only technically valid so far. We have more problems to uncover, but it's now exposed to problems 5 through 8. Now look what happens if there's only 1 item in our green set. Remember, it's nonsensical to make a set with only 1 item. Let's say the only item just so happens to be the claimed version of capital G God. In this case, the phrase, everything which begins to exist has a cause, is tantamount to saying capital G does not have a cause, because he's the only thing in the set. Premise 1 of Kalam is not changed at all by saying capital G God does not have a cause. The same information is transmitted, and we've broken no rules of inference. This is important, so I've highlighted in orange what I'm saying here, and it bears repeating. If there is only 1 item in the set of all things which did not begin to exist, premise 1 is no different than saying capital G God does not have a cause. To make Kalam consistent and differentiate things which have beginnings and things which don't, premise 2 has to become the universe is not capital G God. If supernatural religious apologists can only give us a single item in the set of things which did not begin to exist, this version of Kalam is identical in content. Our sets would include everything except one thing in the blue, and only one thing in the green, of course by our axiomatic assertion only. But remember, there is no sense in establishing a single item set. If you make a set with only 1 item, it's not a set. It's just the 1 item, which again is special pleading. Problem number 13 is the single item set. In the meantime, assuming they can only give us 1 item, look, remember problem number 2, hidden premise? Now it's obvious again in both syllogisms. And problem number 3, including your conclusion in the premise. Notice, the problem Kalam was invented to avoid, including your conclusion in the premise, it still is a problem to contend with if supernatural religious apologists only have 1 item in your set of things which did not begin to exist. Supernatural religious apologists can avoid this problem by giving us multiple items of which did not begin to exist. Problem number 13 is a big deal, so I'm going to offer another graphic to summarize the options religious apologists have for things which did not begin to exist. If 0 items, there's no sense in making an empty set. In this case, all existent things would have a cause, including their claimed version of a god. They've hidden a premise, it exists, which is argument by assertion. They've begged the question by including the conclusion in premise 1. In the case of multiple items which did not begin to exist, the syllogism would technically be valid, not colloquially, but supernatural religious apologists can't make this list, because as soon as they admit something other than their claimed version of a god exists without a beginning, it's no longer special, i.e. they need to be able to special plead to make this seem rational. In the case of 1 item, a single item set is not a set, it's just the 1 item, and they've special pleaded for hidden premise by assertion only and begged the question by including the conclusion in premise 1. Sample question to ask someone who has made this mistake of a single item set: have you included the conclusion in your premise? Have you started with your answer? Have you argued in a circle? Which is another way of pointing out problem number 3, circular reasoning, begging the question, meat and potatoes. Problem number 14, an illicit negative. This one is a formal logical fallacy. These are a very big deal. An informal fallacy just means your premise doesn't support your conclusion. A formal one means you don't even have basic coherence. An illicit negative is a formal fallacy. You cannot get a positive conclusion from a negative premise. Premise 1 has a negative, i.e., not have a cause. Premise 2 has another negative, i.e., not capital G God. Yet they are trying to use this as a case for a positive conclusion. Tisk tisk. A method 3 question to ask someone who has made this error may sound like, can a positive conclusion be derived from a negative premise? Again, the right answer is an emphatic no. I've rated this question as silver because while it's decapitating to these apologetics, it's esoteric and not many people care about the nuts and bolts of formal logic rules. Next, for semantic issues. Semantics is a big field of study covering a wide breadth of disciplines. I can't do it justice in a short video, so I'm only going to break it down into 2 categories. If one person says the word soda, and another person says the word pop, Coke, soft drink, they're all using different words to talk about the same thing, carbonated, cold, sugary beverage. The meanings of the words converge, so I'm going to call these convergent semantics. Another term for this is synonym. This differs from a word like hurricane. When someone says hurricane, they could be referring to one of these. This is Hurricane Michael when it came on shore in Panama City, 2018. They could be talking about the sports team from the University of Miami. If you're in New Orleans and you order a hurricane, they aren't going to bring you a tropical storm or a sports team, they're going to bring you a cocktail. This guy is Reuben Carter, wrongfully imprisoned for murder. His nickname was the Hurricane. Word usages which diverge in meaning. I'm calling these divergent semantics, also known as polysemious. This is relevant to cosmological arguments for a virtual cornucopia of reasons. Problem number 15 is treating divergent semantics as synonyms, most notably in the word cause, begins, universe, and exists. This is also known as the ambiguity fallacy, when an unclear phrase or multiple definitions is used within the argument, therefore does not support the conclusion. Some will say single words count for the ambiguity fallacy, which is really a specific form of fallacy known as equivocation. Digging deeper into this description, equivocation, which is also known as doublespeak, is using an ambiguous term in more than one sense, thus making an argument misleading. These come from a book called Logically Fallacious by Dr. Bo Bennett. This is the bread and butter of supernatural religious apologetics. Back to our dartboard. Starting with the word cause, this is a subproblem of 15 I'm calling 15a. Think about how something like a snowstorm is caused. A snowman. Are they caused the same way? No. Snowstorms are caused unintentionally. Snowmen are caused intentionally. These are not equivalent ways things are caused, but to just say cause without specifying is ambiguous. 15b. The same can be said about unconscious causes and conscious causes. A method 2 type question could be, how are we using the word cause? Or, what do you mean by the word cause? Are all causes the same type of events? How can we have knowledge of causes outside of the universe? 15c is another equivocation embedded within the word cause. Things like snowmen and snowstorms are caused naturally. If a claimed version of a god exists, it exists in some supernatural way. These types of causes are different. Back to my dartboard. Remember, the only difference with kalam was the verbal sleight of hand when they added the words begins to and began to. Well, everything I just said about cause also applies to begins, began. Intentionally, naturally, cosmological arguments equivocate in the same way with begins as it does with the word cause. All the same questions I suggested to help someone realize their mistake, which worked for cause, apply equally as well to begins, began. Substitute the words begins, began, beginning, wherever you used cause from the earlier suggestions. Problem 15d. Think about an open hand and a fist. Open hand, fist, hand. What this illustrates is a manner in which things are, quote, created. Closing fingers makes a hand into a fist. But did I really create something new? Or did I just rearrange prior existing material? Where does the fist go when I open my fingers? It doesn't really go anywhere because what we agreed to call a fist is a label we slap onto an arrangement of fingers and their relationship to my palm. This is a principle known to philosophers by the phrases creatio ex materia, which is creation out of material and creation out of nothing. These are different ways things are said to have been caused or began. The issue for cosmological arguments is they treat creation as one type of event. It's a problem because we only have evidence for causes, beginnings out of material. To say some claimed version of a god can somehow manipulate discrete sets of nothing and in some way turn it into a something is without priors. We have no examples of claimed versions of gods changing nothings into somethings. As a side note, if you're talking to someone who claims to be a variety of Christian or Jewish apologists, Genesis doesn't say anything about creatio ex materia or nihilo. The dubious inference was added later by eager theologians. All examples we have are of material changing relationships and beginning out of something. Fists, hurricanes, snowstorms, snowmen, cocktails, all of them. To treat all creation as one and not specify is equivocation. A good question to ask someone could be, are beginnings out of material the same types of events as beginnings out of nothing? 15e. Aristotle recognized there are different ways to talk about this concept of causation. He broke it down into 4 types: efficient, material, formal, final. An efficient cause would be something like you making a snowman, the entity or action responsible for an event. Material cause would be the material stuff out of which something is made: snow, carrots, top hat, coal, etc. Formal is the form something takes, a snowman proper. Final cause is the purpose for which something is made: family memories, whimsical decorations, pictures, etc. 2 points here. Aristotle used phrasing which was more akin to kinds of explanations rather than saying cause. If mostly for translation reasons, it's practically the same idea though. Also, formal and final cause don't have much utility in this conversation. I include them here mostly for posterity. Just the efficient, which is the effector, and the material, which is the affected. This is important because when cosmological arguments ambiguously just say cause, they conflate efficient causes with material. Again, this is equivocation. A question driving at this could be, are all causes the same types of events? Again, the right answer should be no. To recap the problems contained within just the word cause and begins: committing the ambiguity fallacy, duplicity, equivocation, bait and switching, synonyms for divergent semantics, conflating creation from material and creation from nothing, fallacy of composition. We know causes happen inside the universe, not necessarily to the universe. It co-locates causes with their effects. It conflates efficient causes with material. Now, I am accusing supernatural religious apologists of equivocation. Some disagree with my charge. The objection sounds roughly, for this to be considered equivocation, we would have to show supernatural religious apologists have a responsibility to make a distinction between different uses of these terms. They don't because they are using the terms generally. Let's look at this complaint with regard to just the word cause, with kalam as a template. The word cause appears in premise 1 and the conclusion. In premise 1, the word is used generally. People who make this objection are right to say the use is consistent if it's also a general cause in the conclusion. But if the argument is used to argue for a specific claimed version of a god, then the usage of cause would cease being consistent throughout the syllogism. As soon as you make this move, you've given up the ability to claim it's used generally, because your intent in making the argument is as a case for the existence of a specific claimed version of a god. Another issue with this objection: let's say apologists were specific with their words. Instead of just saying cause, they annotated what kind of cause. Take conscious versus unconscious causes. Rewrite the argument respective of this. Premise 1. Everything which begins to exist has a conscious cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a conscious cause. Now the syllogism is using the word unambiguously, consistently, which is fine for the conclusion because allegedly claimed versions of gods are conscious agents, if they exist. But what about things like hurricanes and snowstorms? They don't have conscious causes, so the argument wouldn't encompass them. The argument needs to use these terms in a vague manner to be persuasive, because problems like this occur for every equivocation I've pointed out, and I'm far from done itemizing them. Another example of why this objection doesn't hold water: ex materia. The syllogism would look like this. Premise 1. Everything which begins to, ex materia, exist has a material cause. The universe, ex materia, began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a material cause. Great. This actually works because it uses cause and begins consistently and unambiguously. But look at what problems it introduces. If using the argument to make a case for the existence of a specific claimed version of a god they want us to think exists, they've just argued it has to be a material cause. Is their claimed version of a god material? Last one. Natural causes, for instance. Premise 1. Everything which begins to exist has a natural cause. Premise 2. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a natural cause. Now we're being precise and specific with our language, but we've just painted any claimed version of a god into a corner only natural things can occupy. Are they supposed to be natural? Mortals? Then what makes them special? Are apologists prepared to grapple with arguing for the existence of a natural claimed version of a god? We also can't establish the existence of supernatural causes by pointing at natural things. This is problem number 24, coming up later. Of course, this doesn't work. Apologetics are leveraging ambiguity to make their case seem coherent, so this objection fails. I just spent a lot of ammunition on the words cause and begins. My next target is the word universe. The etymology of universe is uni, one. Verse, not a perfect translation, but most closely relates to our modern word for version. Universe equals one version, or only one version, or only version, or all versions, or all things, or everything. In most contexts, the word universe is a synonym for everything. Problem number 16 can be expressed with a set. Let's put all things in our set, or everything, space-time, universe, cosmos. Notice cosmos is in red because this is above my pay grade, but apologists talk about it, so I have to talk about what they talk about. Rounding out our set is all existence and all sets. The problem is cosmological arguments put claimed versions of gods here, outside the set, which could very well be incompatible properties. If you think a claimed version of a God exists outside of all existence, I think you're probably right, because this is tantamount to saying it is equal to nothing. This is a long-winded way of explaining Russell's paradox, of Bertrand Russell fame, problem number 17. Does the set of all sets which does not include itself? Either yes or no, it wouldn't satisfy its own definition. Cosmological arguments treat the universe as if it's a subset of its own set. There's another way to express the error taking place here, and for this brief discussion I'll be borrowing heavily from Dan Barker's book Godless, most notably chapter 8. It's good, you should read it. Let's compare a syllogism next to Kalam. Premise 1. Every apple which falls from a tree gets bruised. Premise 2. This orange fell from a tree. Therefore, this orange has a bruise. You see the problem right away. Oranges are not members of the set of apples. This argument compares apples to oranges, just like Kalam does, because it treats the universe as a subset of everything. Everything, apple, which begins to exist has a cause. The universe, orange, began to exist. Therefore, the universe, orange, has a cause. Apple in premise 1, orange in premise 2, and the conclusion. Same problem as Russell's paradox and the fallacy of composition. Barker's comparative syllogism is just another way of illustrating the silliness apologists are up to. This compels me to talk about the word universe and how it's used. It doesn't always function as a synonym for everything. Data suggests there could be a multiverse, which is a giant can of worms I probably shouldn't get into, and wouldn't if I had better judgment. But again, feel obligated because supernatural religious apologists talk about it, and I have to talk about the way they talk about it. It's important to remember different multiverse theories are postulated as possibilities. We have no direct evidence of observable multiverses. These are mostly speculative based upon what we can observe and assuming uniformity beyond. If we were to talk about the totality of multiverses, we'd need to employ the term cosmos. There are competing ideas running around about what the best interpretation of the data is. For now, I'm going to stick with just the parallel and chain versions of multiverse theories. What if our local representation of the universe is not everything? We are only able to observe a limited portion via our senses and tools which augment them. Within our limited ability, we measure things by way of their temperature, mass, time, velocity, location, distance. It's how we give each other coordinates to know when you're observing one thing and not another. If there was something, hypothetically, occupying this area outside of our observable universe, how would we find out? What observations can we make? What test could we run? How could we verify anything? I don't know. None, and we can't. So far as we're able to ascertain, it's a complete mystery if the area even exists. All we can do is make the observations and measurements we have access to, balance descriptive equations, assume uniformity, and make theoretical predictions. Our brains are contained within the confines of the area we're able to observe, so we make conceptual models of the possibilities. These models suggest our universe is not alone. Contained within the cosmos could be other multiverses. Another possibility is there are even multiverses contained within our universe, or both. They could all be existing simultaneously in parallel, i.e. parallel universes. Even our own universe could have existed in another state prior to the one we're experiencing. Depending on how much push and pull the forces of nature exert, there could have been an infinite number of Big Bang, Big Crunch cycles, bubbling up from one state to another, each version being only able to measure using its own available tools. It's just a limit we're stuck with. The relevance to semantics in regard to cosmological arguments here is when a philosopher uses the term universe, they are generally treating it as a synonym for everything. When a cosmologist wants to say everything, they'll say cosmos. Let's talk about the tools we have and why we think what we think about the cosmos. If you've ever noticed how a car sounds as it's approaching you is different than the way it sounds as it's going away from you, this is due to the Doppler effect. As the car approaches, the sound waves it's emitting are squeezing together, which changes the frequency of how often each crest and trough meets your eardrum. This squeezing makes it sound higher pitched. As the car passes and travels away, the same sound waves it's producing get stretched out and your perception of the pitch gets lower. Light waves do this too. Approaching cars shift their light waves to appear more bluish in color, and objects moving away from us stretch the light to make it appear more red to us. Conveniently enough, we call this phenomenon redshift and blueshift. Edwin Hubble looked at all the galaxies around us and discovered they were moving away because the light from them was shifted red. This is the measuring tool we use to talk about what's going on in our observable universe. By analogy, redshift, blueshift is the ruler. When we use it to measure the whole of our universe, it has limitations, because the quote beginning of the ruler is just the edge. It has no ability to measure past its own edge. To tie this back into cosmological arguments, this is problem number 18. In the case of a multiverse, specifically the chain, where everything is in a constant cycle of either a Big Bang or Big Crunch, the universe did not begin to exist in the same way supernatural religious apologists think it did. As Dr. Sean Carroll points out in his book, The Big Picture, pages 43 and 44, by the way, read this book, it's fantastic. He says, maybe it's not really a beginning in the way we think of it. It could be a first moment in of time. He goes on further to state, we don't know whether the Big Bang was the actual beginning of time, but it was a moment in time beyond beyond which we can't see any farther into the past. So it is the beginning of our observable part of the cosmos. It's probably better to not even think of it as a first anything, more like a last moment we can account for looking backwards with our current methods of interrogation. Read, premise 2 of cosmological arguments is wrong. This was partially addressed earlier in problem 15d. All of these things have material beginnings in time. The first moment of time is a different category of idea, and to treat them as one is equivocation. The bummer is, without going through all this each time with a supernatural religious apologist, you can't express this briefly. The best I can come up with is the statement, we don't really know if the universe had a beginning in the sense apologists are using the word. Understanding the limitations of red, blue shift, we can say the universe had an earliest moment, prior to which our language and methods of measurement break down. It's a mouthful and cumbersome in a face-to-face conversation, which is part of the reason apologists like this argument, because properly exposing the errors is time-consuming. Que sera, sera. Apologists have an objection to problem 18. They'll say, but really smart guys say the universe had a beginning, which is correct. Here's famed theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking saying, what I have done is to show that it is possible for the way the universe began to be determined by the laws of science. In that case, it would not be necessary to appeal to God to decide how the universe began. This doesn't prove that there is no God, only that God is unnecessary. Yes, Hawking certainly used the word began here multiple times. An important issue at hand here are linguistic limitations. There is a fundamental difference between our ideas and material things. Let's say I want to communicate something about this thing. I may choose to use the word banana. This word was invented by us. We did not discover it. It's our agreed upon convention to talk about a thing. But things exist in different ways, conceptual and material. The words we choose to use to talk about them can describe our ideas, and they can describe material things. Our words can also prescribe the idea in a mind, but can they prescribe anything about material? No, of course not. Our words have no prescriptive authority over material things. Things aren't obligated to conform to our invented ways of talking about them. The word banana only works because practitioners of the English language agree this particular sound culturally correlates to certain ideas and temporary relationships of molecules and atoms. Those molecules and atoms don't have the ability to care what we subjectively decide to label them. So if someone arbitrarily decides to use the word blam floop when they intend to talk about this thing, they haven't communicated their idea successfully, even though blam floop is every bit as arbitrary as banana was when it was first invented. This applies to all terms, including beginning. Material is not beholden to our ways of talking about it. Don't confuse our subjectively invented label for the objectively discovered thing. Don't confuse description with prescription. They're not equivalent. Anyone who thinks our words can prescribe something into the material world around us is committing a reification fallacy. This is the burger and fries of apologetics. It's when an abstraction is treated as if it were a concrete real event or physical entity. In other words, it is the error of treating something that is not concrete, such as an idea, as a concrete thing. Please don't do this. When the late great Stephen Hawking used began, he was speaking poetically, figuratively, colloquially, in a formal physics kind of way, not literally. Language has limitations. He was an expert in science, not an expert in rhetoric, and how people would take his words literally, then quote mine him to make it seem like he was bolstering their preferred version of theology. The next objection is, if secular science is allowed to have something exist outside the universe, why can't we? You say multiverse, we say capital G God. Here's the difference. When scientists talk about the multiverse, in this case a multiverse which would be separate from our local universe, they are theorizing based on measurable, repeatable data, expressed in balanced equations with tremendous predictive prowess. Most of it is speculation about possibilities, not dogmatic questions stopping assertions. Supernatural religious attempts at explanations are based on presuppositions, fallacies, most notably the fallacy of composition, argument from ignorance, God of the gaps, reification. We have no verifiable priors for supernatural causation, and every event we do have commensurate evidence for has turned out to be natural, not supernatural. This has been a one-way journey as we've shed outdated models for attempting to explain what we see and adopted more reliable methods. Problem number 19. When cosmological arguments flippantly use universe, they're neglecting the fact it's the only version of universe we have access to. So it's provisionally everything we know exists. This doesn't necessarily make it everything hypothetically, just everything practically. If and only if universe is a synonym for everything, then I can change the syllogism to reflect this. Everywhere there was the word universe, I can supplement the word everything, and the argument hasn't changed. This is what it means to genuinely have synonymous terms. Switch 'em back. Switch 'em back. Now look what this does to the conclusion of Kalam. Everything has a cause. It's the same problem we saw before. If and only if the universe equals everything, and if and only if a claimed version of a God is a thing, God needs a cause, along with hidden assumption, begging the question, etc. Kalam has the same flaw as the classic in this case, so the question, where does God come from, turns out still to be salient, and although Professor Mustache looked like the goat, technically he was on the right path. His only mistake was jumping the gun and arguing against a point Hovind hadn't made yet, and he also didn't have the time to dig through what's going on with these arguments to expose them for what they are, like I just have. Asking what caused God, or who created God, all point out the same errors. Apologists will cry a river about this. They make long videos explaining how this is the worst objection they've ever heard to Kalam, but the fact fact is the argument is only a fancy way of hiding the same errors we've seen over and over. Hidden assumptions, begging the questions, paradoxes, etc. They say God doesn't need a cause. He's a necessity. He can't not exist, blah blah blah. But what it really comes down to is when they say universe, they don't mean everything. They mean everything except my claimed version of a God, which is textbook special pleading, problem number 20, which is the sushi and sake of apologetics. And trying to define things into existence, problem 21. We've covered a lot of ground on the word universe, but look at our dartboard. The arguments also rely on using the word everything. Sneaky, sneaky. Notice how they try to separate it out as if it were two different things, just by fiat. Everything I just said about the word universe has parallels with the way cosmological arguments use the word everything. Here's my recap for all the issues going on with the words universe and everything. If and only if a claimed version of a God is a thing, the argument makes a case for either non-existence or it needing a cause beginning. It equates the very thing it's trying to argue for with nothing, paradoxically, because it ascribes incompatible properties. It treats the universe as a subset of everything. Russell's paradox. And premise 2 of the arguments being wrong because the universe did not begin to exist the way supernatural religious apologists want to think it did. Turning attention to the way the arguments use the word exist. I've already talked about this problem a little bit, but to dig deeper, this is number 22. We can talk about this concept of existence a couple different ways. Let's separate it into material and immaterial existence. Starting on the material side, we can use language to talk about things on different scales of abstraction, descriptively of the things and prescriptively of our ideas, but not prescriptively of the things. A hurricane is one convenient way to talk about a large collection of water droplets, but a water droplet is composed of smaller parts, water molecules. If you zoom in farther, you stop seeing individual molecules and start seeing atoms discernible from one another. Each molecule is 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen. Keep zooming in and you can see a singleton atom. This periodic table is a list of all atom types based on the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons. If you keep zooming in on these particles, you can start to see even smaller subcomponents like gluons, leptons, up and down quarks, etc. Once you make this last leap from the atomic level of abstraction and lower, things start to behave in a funky way. This is one of the reasons I've color-coded it as red, particularly the subatomic particles. This is the quantum realm where our Newtonian intuitions lead us astray and make understanding the behaviors of these particles difficult. Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, quantum entanglement, quantum leaps, among others. They don't act in the classical ways we are accustomed to at the human level of perceived abstraction without the aid of very sophisticated tools. Theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss, in his book The Greatest Story Ever Told so far, says on page 214, by the way, read it, it's really good, quantum mechanics blurs our distinction between something and nothing. So there is no question things on the quantum level of abstraction exist. And it's the fundamental underlying composition of all things which are made up of these smaller parts. But they don't behave the same as their larger composites. What is accurate about them and their behaviors doesn't necessarily hold when you bind them together for whatever they're making up. In other words, just because subatomic particles behave in an entangled way doesn't mean when a whole bunch of them are bonded together to form a larger thing, this larger thing experiences entanglement with similar larger objects. What's correct for the subset is not always correct for the set. This is a frequent ploy by apologists. Talk about the spooky things subatomic particles do. Make an analogy to bigger things, act like there is some sort of transitive force making the big thing behave like the small thing, and it's wrong, so I have to point it out. Moving on. Things can also exist in an immaterial way. They're no less real than things which exist in a material way, they just exist in a different manner. Conceptual objects like abstractions and numbers. Concepts exist in the mind. We only have evidence for minds existing in brains. You heard Kent Hovind touch on this when he said, "You'd have to explain things to me like love and kindness." Well, they're perfectly explainable as functions of the mind, which we only find in brains. Supernatural religious apologists will frequently accuse skeptics of claiming immaterial things don't exist, which doesn't reflect my ideas at all. I think immaterial things are very real. I just understand the way they exist, as functions of the mind. Hurricane is a useful way we humans have invented for talking about the discovered weather phenomenon. It wouldn't make much sense to talk about a hurricane by naming all its component atoms and molecules. Hurricanes are surely real, and the concepts of them are just as real, but real in a different manner.
Some things don't really fit in either category. It is fair to say most things are either material or immaterial. However, there are 4 fundamental forces of nature which act on material. The strong nuclear force which binds the nucleus of atoms, the weak nuclear force which we see during radioactive decay, the electromagnetic force which holds all the particles of an atom together, and gravity. These things very much exist in a materially effective kind of way, but it's not fair to say they are composed of particles. I can't explain these much better than the diagram displays, and if you tell me you can, I'm going to ask for your academic bona fides. Supernatural religious apologists have an objection to problem 22, akin to, if secular science is allowed to have something immaterial exist, which is not purely the function of minds, why can't we? You say fundamental forces of nature, we say capital G God. Here's the difference. Commensurate evidence. We have it for the forces of nature. They are materially effective. We can measure these forces even though they aren't composed of smaller particles. So far as I know, we have no commensurate evidence for the existence of any claimed version of a God. All we have is arguments, rhetoric, fallacies, assertions, appeals to personal experiences, etc. None of these are commensurate with the kind of claimed versions of gods who can move mountains. Incommensurate evidence is again the tacos and burritos of supernatural religious apologetics. This objection fails because we have commensurate evidence for the existence of fundamental forces of nature and none for any claimed version of a god.
Cosmological arguments treat exist as one thing when they don't specify between different types of existence. Unfortunately, pointing this out to people with leading questions forces you to say some pretty silly things like, what does it mean for something to exist? Do people use the word exist in only one way? Do all things exist in the same way? Not the most idea-shaking questions, but it's a starting point to a conversation. Problem 22a. Consider how something like a unicorn exists. And how does a horse exist? Unicorns are fictional. Horses are not fictional. These ways of existing are not equivalent. And to group them as one single mode of existing is, again, you guessed it, equivocation. I told you this was the bread and butter of supernatural religious apologetics. Horses very much exist in the minds of people who know what horses are, and they also exist tangibly. Unicorns, I'm not aware of any commensurate evidence for them existing tangibly, but I'm not skeptical they exist conceptually. In the same way unicorns exist, I think claimed versions of gods exist too. They exist in the minds of people who claim to believe in them. This doesn't mean they're material or materially effective. Questions you could ask are the same as for problem 22 basic, but the answer should be different because the error being made is. Why do they do this? Problem number 22b. I think it's because they don't have any commensurate evidence for the existence of their claimed version of a god, and attempt to give credence to the idea it does by conversationally placing it adjacent to things which actually do exist. We don't really know if they exist in anything other than a purely conceptual way, so they try to borrow existence. If and only if their claimed versions of gods are fictional, this is a move to equate non-existent things with existent things. I call this existence borrowing, by adjacency and ambiguity. My suggested questions remain consistent for problem 22b, but now you have my idea of existence borrowing in your toolbox you can use to discuss. There's a related problem to existence borrowing, a more formal version, and it's 22c. Not really semantics related, more of a broad problem, but better to talk about it now after my existence borrowing explanation. This is part of how the argument has multiple layered overlapping issues. A valid mode of inference within formal logic called modus ponens. It's Latin for mode of positive, or the affirming way. It goes like this. If x, then y. X, so y. X is the antecedent, which means it comes before, and y is the consequent, which means it's a consequence of the antecedent. Casually, this would function like this. If hurricane, then windy. Hurricane, so windy. You've affirmed the positive existence of wind by first finding the hurricane via a modus ponens inference. This is a valid logical move. The problem is, sometimes people think they're doing this, but they get it backwards. They'll start off right by saying, if x, then y, but then reverse the order by saying y, so x. This is called affirming the consequent, which is the wine and cheese of apologetics. If hurricane, then wind, wind, so hurricane. You can't do this because it could be windy for other reasons besides hurricane. We haven't affirmed the existence of a hurricane by observing wind. You have to find the hurricane first, then, via modus ponens, affirm the reason for the wind. How this manifests in apologetics. They're saying, if capital G God, then universe. Universe, so capital G God. This is the affirming the consequent fallacy. You can't point at a consequence and affirm the existence of the antecedent. You need to find your claimed version of a god first before you can claim it's responsible for anything. As far as suggested questions, this problem is a little more esoteric. You wouldn't want to spend the time explaining in detail the error, so maybe something simple like the statement, we can't point at something and use it as evidence something else exists as its cause. We need to first find the cause before we can start ascribing it effects. Bronze, because this isn't going to resonate with many people, but another tool for your toolbox. A related problem is 22d. I'm calling infinite sufficiency. If someone thinks they can affirm the consequent, then any antecedent can be said to exist via this felonious move. If Dracula, then banana. Banana, so Dracula. You're not skeptical of the existence of bananas, are you? Then by this reasoning, you have to concede the existence of Dracula too. We can fabricate anything, if existent, could explain anything else. The same thing works for Santa. If Santa, then presents under the tree. Presents under the tree, so Santa. I'll confess I found this compelling when I was 5 years old. There's overlap here with number 8. It was gap 2 problem of not knowing what kind of cause the argument tries to conclude. Back to semantics. Problem 23. Recall our viral video. Remember when Hovind was lamenting about wheres and whens things exist? This is actually a problem for his claimed version of a god, but he's trying to pass the burden onto the universe itself. He understands existence is contingent upon having a where and a when to exist, yet he doesn't apply this to his own claimed version of a god. If I was trying to knock someone off their script, I would ask them how do materially effective things exist without a time or space to exist in? We saw problem number 24 earlier too, because there's lots of overlap. Cosmological arguments try to make the case for the existence of supernatural things by appealing to the existence of natural things. No amount of inductively observed natural things establishes the existence of a single supernatural thing in the same way no amount of natural apples establishes the existence of supernatural oranges. Ask them, does the existence of natural things establish the existence of supernatural things? Of course it does not. To summarize the ground I've covered simply on the use of the word exist, apologists equivocate fictional and non-fictional existence, physical and non-physical existence, attempt to borrow existence by adjacency and ambiguity, try to argue for the existence of supernatural things by pointing at natural things, tries to obscure the fact material and materially effective things only exist with a place and time to exist, affirms the consequent, and infinite possibilities. Here's my dartboard. I talked about how apologists torture the words cause, begins, began to, universe, everything, and exists. Look what's left over. These are the only words apologists haven't tried to leverage the ambiguity of. Equivocation is their bread and butter. This is my favorite slide, so I'm going to show it again. Nietzsche said, "The most perfidious way of harming a cause consists of defending it deliberately with faulty arguments." Personally, I think Nietzsche was overrated, but he definitely scored a bullseye here. Now, to circle back to the way the argument sounds casually, but first it's important to explain what types of answers specific questions are designed to yield. Typical questions follow one of these formats: who, what, why, when, where, and how. If someone asks a who question, the expected answer is usually an agent. The phrasing assumes the answer will be a who, and whos are agents. When questions yield a location in time, where questions a location in space, how is a process and a method, why questions presuppose a purpose, and what questions are a bit of a contextual wildcard. Armed with this knowledge, let's look at our casual arguments. Where did everything come from? You can respond directly with method 1 style and say, I don't know. If you genuinely don't know, say so. Don't be afraid of I don't know. It's an honest position if you actually do not know. Only dishonest people pretend to know things they don't know. If you're a dishonest person, stop it. There's a lot going on with this simple phrase. Supernatural religious apologists love it when people say, I don't know. We are not comfortable looking ignorant, especially in public. They are preying on a well-known psychological bias about us needing closure. They're trying to weaponize your uncertainty against you. Facing the fact you don't know something predisposes us to primacy and social attribution, meaning the first answer offered will be glommed onto in favor of the uncomfortable sensation of not knowing. If people around us are acting like a cohesive group who has the answer and will embrace us if we conform, all the better for their evangelical motives. It's a cult recruitment technique. We are also cognitively primed to favor what Michael Shermer calls agenticity, the acts of agents as opposed to unconscious causes. When they've got you against the ropes, they swoop in with pseudo-confidence and assert their ideas are correct. Plus, what they're offering is culturally familiar and thus more likely to be successfully transplanted into your idea set. Some other suggested ways to respond to this question are, I don't know, how do you suggest we find out? Or, I don't know, what do you think is the most reliable way to learn? Or maybe method 2 question and ask them how they're using the word everything. Another question could be, how can you know about the existence of a where outside of everything? This question is relevant to problem 17, which was Russell's paradox we saw earlier. Does the universe contain itself? If there are things outside of everything, where is that thing? If there are places outside of everywhere, where is that place? Circa problem 16, which segues into problem 25. The question, where did everything come from, assumes there are things apart from everything. Consider this. I have a friend from San Diego, but I only know where San Diego is because I know where Los Angeles is. I only know where Los Angeles is because I know where Arizona is. I only know where Arizona is because of its relationship to Mexico, which borders the Pacific Ocean. Seriously, what is an everything? What is a from? What is a where? Everything is not a location. It's all the locations. Everywhere is not a location. It's all the locations. The universe is not a location, it's all the locations. The universe is not a time, it's all the times. Supposing the universe is equal to everything. Froms, wheres, and whens are all things. Where only has meaning if you have another where to compare it to. From only has meaning if referenced to other froms. Everything is equal to all things. Talking about everything necessarily includes all the froms, whens, and wheres. If you're asking this question, you don't know what the words you're using mean. Asking, where did everything come from, is like asking, where did all the froms come from? Or where did all the wheres come from? Wouldn't you feel silly asking this question? I would. I feel silly having to explain it. Subtle questions you can ask someone could be, don't all heres necessarily have locations? Or don't all heres necessarily have times which they occur? Doesn't everything necessarily include all the locations and the times? Problem 26 is specifically for people who claim to believe the supernatural claims of Christianity. If and only if capital G God exists outside the universe, then Jesus couldn't have been capital G God, unless they're saying Jesus didn't exist inside the universe as well. Next on our casual argument list is, how did everything get here? All of the same absurd problems of the previous question apply, so I won't repeat myself. We always have the standard response of I don't know, and I don't know how do you suggest we find out. I'll leave those out going forward to expedite. Other responses could be, isn't everything all of the processes? Isn't everything all of the methods? Isn't here all of the hows? Silly stuff, but when people say silly things to me, sometimes I have to respond in kind. This question is also suffering from problem 16. The next casual argument is, something can't come from nothing. Again, there's a lot going on here. You can respond with the standards, but they'll declare victory and break their arms patting themselves on the back while they loudly assert they have all the answers and proceed to commit almost every fallacy we have a name for. Or you can respond with, how can you know what a nothing is capable of? Or ask them if they have a nothing to examine. I like this one too. If something can't come from nothing, then how did your claimed version of a god make something come from nothing? This puts the paradox back in their lap. Something else important to notice. This casual argument is a double negative, which is problem 27, and it just so happens to be the plate and bowl of religious apologetics. Something can't come from nothing. When you use a double negation like this, they cancel each other out. You can point this out by saying, isn't this a double negative? Or didn't you really say something can come from something? Which really isn't in dispute. Moving down the list. From nothing, nothing comes. Another double negative, along with the next one. There's never been nothing. I'm going to circle back to these double negatives soon. Next one. There's always been something. This is covered by almost everything we've discussed up to this point. Problems 1 through 26. This statement fires on all cylinders. Remember, everything which exists began to exist at the beginning of existence. If a claimed version of a god exists, it began at the beginning of existence. In the past, I've said things like, I agree, as long as there's been existence, existent things have existed. Next on the list. Things don't create themselves. I would agree with the statement, inside the universe we only have examples of things not created themselves. On a Newtonian level of abstraction. On a quantum level of abstraction, particles pop in and out of various forms of existence all the time. Next, what happened before the Big Bang? Problem 16 and 18. It's like asking, what is north of the North Pole? Late, great Christopher Hitchens, whom we love. The North Pole is the point at which we start measuring how far south you are. If you're standing on the North Pole, the only direction you can travel is south. It is the anchor point for our manner of measuring. If you're standing at the Big Bang, the only direction you can travel is into the future. Asking what happened before the first moment is like asking what happened after the last moment. You don't understand what is meant by the words first, last, before, after, moment, or all of them. Why is there something rather than nothing? Remember the kinds of responses different types of questions are intended to yield. A why question yields a purpose answer. Purpose only comes from agents. If you're asking a why type question, you've automatically assumed there is a who to assign it a purpose. This question begs the question. I'm sure you remember his problem number 3, the meat and potatoes. When asked this question, I've generally responded with, why do you assume there's a why? Last but not least, who created the universe? Meat and potatoes again. I ask, why are you assuming there's a why? Or, how can a who exist outside of existence? This is Ray Comfort, famed banana enthusiast. He didn't technically say these words, but I think a fair paraphrase of his shtick would be, we know capital G God exists because creation exists. You can't have creation without a creator in the same way you can't have a building without a builder or a painting without a painter. By now you should be able to see the multiple layered errors contained in this statement. It's pretty much the entirety of what we've been talking about in problems 1 through 27 in one form or another. Just for some of the lowlights, he's conflating invented things with discovered things, begging the question, citing material examples as evidence of immaterial things. Things to say in response to this kind of silliness could be, why do you get to call it creation? Or, is this a good analogy? Because I can go talk with a builder. I can read their blueprints, watch a painter paint. Can I watch your claimed version of a god create in the same way? Is the word creation an invented kind of thing or discovered kind of thing? Another trick he's playing here is prescriptivism, which is the reification fallacy, the burger and fries. By calling the universe creation and therefore assuming it has a creator, he's trying to impose our labels on material things as if they must obey. If you can't have creation without a creator, you can't have existence without an exister, or reality without a realtor. So does an exister exist because of existence? Does a realtor exist because real estate exists? I said we'd circle back around to a couple of these concepts. Let's have a long conversation about nothing. It plays a central role in a lot of cosmological type conversations, so it's crucial to be precise. Here's a couple memes to illustrate my point. On the left is from Frank Turek's apologetic website Cross-Examine. On top it says, no one created something out of nothing, atheistic view, and on the bottom it says, someone created something out of nothing, theistic view. On the right we have interview guy asking candidate guy, so you're an atheist? Candidate guy, yes. Interviewer, why don't you believe in capital G God? Candidate, I don't believe in silly magic. Interviewer, so who created the universe? Candidate, it came from nothing. Interviewer, incredulous stare. Broadly, casual cosmological arguments like the ones we've looked at talk about nothing like it's a thing, which is problem 28. There is no state of existence called nothing. I once saw a limerick in an online discussion I thought about for a while on this subject. Nothing can't exist, because for nothing to exist, existence must first exist. If existence exists, nothing can't exist. This uses the word nothing as if it's a thing like cosmological arguments do, but I think it's interesting and gives you something to think about. It also contains double negatives. When pressed, apologists will object, saying the way they are using the word nothing is, quote, what rocks dream about, which is partially a red herring, category error, paradox, not really meant to advance the conversation, but more of a way for them to throw you off the trail. What I think is comical is, like I illustrated in problem 16, if their claimed version of a god exists in the same way this particular nothing exists, I'm inclined to agree with them. As it turns out, the word nothing is a divergent semantic. I'm going to break it down this way. Casual nothing, I'm abbreviating Charlie November. Physicist nothing, Papa November. Apologists nothing, Alpha November, and nothing nothing, November November. Why do we need all these specified kinds of nothing? Think about this room. If you're a real estate agent describing this to a buyer, you might say there's currently nothing in this room. But is it really fair to say there is nothing in the room? Isn't there paint on the walls? Blinds on the window? Wood planks on the floors? In the case of casual nothing, it's an expression we use when we want to communicate emptiness, when you'd expect there to be something like furniture or art on a wall. Casual nothing can be air, unoccupied, blank. If someone asks what you did this weekend and you say nothing, you really mean nothing exciting. You were still respirating, circulating, digesting. You mean nothing in a casual way. Charlie November. Physicist nothing is another kind of nothing. I'm not a physicist, therefore I'm not qualified to talk about it. So you should read their books and then go ask them. They've got some trouble to carefully explain what they mean, but if I had to speculate based on things I've read, they say things like quantum vacuum and nothing is inherently stable. Seriously, read their books. November November. It's no things. Break the word apart. No things. No space, no time, no space-time, no existence, no universe, etc. It's a paradox to even talk about, because as soon as you use the word nothing, you've talked about it like it was a thing. There is no state of existence called nothing. We can only talk about it as a concept. Alpha November is the same as November November with one additional thing, some claimed version of a god. They're trying to have this both ways. Something which exists, existing next to November November. Hence why cosmological arguments reduce to unavoidable paradoxes. A recap in one page. This is busy. Charlie November is in one way a concept, absence inside of existence like an empty room. Papa November is also a concept. And to quickly summarize what I think they're saying, inductive inference of possible events outside the realm our instruments can gather data, based on observing events inside the universe, measuring them, assuming cosmological consistency, describing them with balanced equations, and hypothesizing possibilities. In other words, go ask them, go read their books. Or you can always go get your own PhD in astrotheoretical physics, develop your own theories, and report back. I'll be interested to see what you come up with. November November. Non-existence. It's a paradox. Impossible for us to know because it lays outside the area in which we are able to know things. It doesn't fit in our minds. It's a paradox because we think of it as an existent thing, but at the same time it's inconceivable because it is no things. An inconceivable concept. The paradox to end all paradoxes. Alpha November. Again a concept, but when you dig down deep with an apologist, they'll concurrently assert it's November November, but then try to put their claimed version of God right next to it. This is clearly a problem since they want you to think their claimed version of a God is anything but nothing. It's their whole point. Another way to think of November November. A number line like you use in grade school. Negatives on the left, positive on the right, all the way to infinity. What is a zero? Is it a value? Is it an integer? Can you count to zero? Even or odd? Positive or negative? What if I told you I had 1,000,000 bananas in my house? Would you believe me? Would you want to check for yourself? 1,000,000 bananas seems like a lot, but they could probably fit inside a standard size home. Ostensibly, you could verify this claim. What if I told you I have all the bananas? Would you need to check my house? How about if I said none of the bananas? This is a different claim because the amount of bananas is not specified if I say all or none. If it was 1,000,000, you could hypothetically count, but how do you count to all or none? What about infinity bananas? Would you still need to come to my house to see if my claim was accurate? Or could you just know from the words I chose there was a mistake somewhere in my thinking? You already know this because you know we can't count to infinity. The biggest number you can think of is closer to zero than infinity. The reason why is because infinity is not a number, just like all and none. They aren't numbers either. So what about zero? Is 0 bananas an amount of bananas? Neither negative nor positive, even or odd, because 0 is not a number either. Just try to divide by 0. If someone tells me they divided by 0, I don't need to check their work to know they goofed up. Anyone who tells you they can doesn't know what 0 or division is, or both. Add 0 to any number on your calculator. Keep pressing plus, 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 plus. You can do this as long as you like. The total doesn't change. Now when you start adding anything besides a 0, the total changes. It's because 0 is not a number, but because of the way our language is structured, we're forced to talk about it as if it were a number. A good thought experiment you'll hear surrounding the subject of infinites is Hilbert's Hotel, a hypothetical hotel with infinite rooms and full occupancy. If you wanted a room, everyone could just move one chronologically higher room number and make space. The symbol for a 0 means not a number. It's a placeholder we use where a number would make sense in our minds. In the same way we're forced to talk about November November as if it were a thing. It's not a thing. It's not a number. It's another label we use where a something would make sense in our minds. You can't have a nothing and a something in the same place at the same time. Places and times are things. This is one of the main problems for cosmological arguments. They try to impose November November on your ideas, but when they talk about their own, they try to sneak in Alpha November below the radar. When pressed, they retreat to silliness like, what rocks dream about? The very act of talking about nothing makes it a something. An actual November November would include the non-existence of any claimed version of a god, in which case I think they're probably right. Their claimed version of a god exists the same way rocks' dreams do. Back to our memes. Notice on the top part of the left side when they strawman the quote atheistic view of nothing, they try to impose the paradox November November. Then when it's time for their own, They use Alpha November. They're not even sly with the scams they try to pull. Same thing about incredulous interviewer guy meme. When the quotes are from the skeptic, he has to embrace the November model just to make the joke work. Here's some ways notable apologists do this. William Lane Craig saying typical things like, capital G God created the universe, so he must exist outside the universe. If there are not things outside the universe, and all existence is inside, saying something exists outside the universe is tantamount to saying it exists outside of existence, which is equivalent to saying it doesn't exist. Paradox. They'll say things like, I have a personal experience of capital G God. However, we only have priors for experiencing happening inside of existence, where all of our observations, measurements, and knowledge take place. How can an observer wholly inside the parameters of the universe have knowledge of possible existent things outside the universe? I have the witness of the Holy Spirit on my heart, except his heart exists inside the universe, along with all witness events we have evidence for. He's famous for saying, to be an atheist, you have to think something can come from nothing. No. A person can self-apply the label atheist without encumbering themselves with philosophical baggage you try to impose. What's funny about this is apologists are the ones who actually think something can come from nothing, as long as their claimed version of God is adjacent to it and able to manipulate it into becoming a something. Last quote, an actual infinite is impossible, except his claimed version of a God which exists infinitely, because he says so. This again is addressed by the thought experiment of Hilbert's Hotel.
Last one is another objection you'll hear to these kinds of issues. Problem 29. Supernatural religious apologists will say, God is a perfect being. I submit to you a chart. Which is the perfect banana? I would say 4, maybe 5, but most people like their bananas a little more ripe. But if I say 4 or 5, and you say 9 or 10, which gets to be the quote-unquote perfect banana? After all, perfection is not the sort of thing we found floating around the universe. It's an expression of our preference. When you tell me something is perfect, you haven't told me anything about the thing. You've only told me something about yourself. Ask people, is perfect an invented kind of thing or discovered kind of thing? Or, isn't the word perfect simply an adjective describing your value of something? Or, is something perfect just because you say so?
I'm going to stop for now. There's more, because apologists can't help themselves. There's always more errors to expose. I'm sure there'll be more material on the subject in the future. My open invitation stands. I'll come to your location and have a face-to-face conversation under certain stipulations. These are my socials. Please follow, comment, like, subscribe, and share. Thanks for watching.